Thanks, Ceann Comhairle. And I actually have a load of amendments in this section related to particularly 47 and 48, so it will take me maybe some time to deal with them. I suppose, initially to start off the discussion by saying that our certain point has to be really that housing in Ireland has been in crisis for the best part of 15 years, and when the government came to power, you really had an opportunity to begin to untangle some of that and deal with it, but it was an opportunity that was wasted. It was the perfect time for ripping things up and starting again. But we had the continued crisis in social housing with a complete collapse in any development in that regard, a failure to seize on the idea of a well-regulated rental sector, and I would say minimal efforts to deal with the mortgage crisis also. So instead what we have really is a rush job on the eve of an election where there's talk about regulating rent, but I do think that what we have before us is piecemeal. It's a bit of a stunt, and I honestly think in some ways that it could make the situation worse, and it is a lost opportunity because the reality is that you've bent to the REITs and the big vulture funds who've come in and begun to dominate the rental market in this state. It's been exaggerated and aggravated by the role of NAMA in selling whole swathes of property at below the cost price to some of these serial renters who've operated as a cartel in this city and the other cities around the country in driving up rents. And I think these measures before us are really insufficient for dealing with this crisis. But I just want to deal with my linked amendments as they appear, and I hope I'm getting this set up right because it is very confusing. But my first amendment, related to Shannon's amendment number 47, is dealing with the issue really of market rent and the definition of market rent. What I'm seeking to do is to insert a new provision which defines market rent as the average price per square metre of a property with equivalent fittings and finish in the same municipal district or local electoral area as applicable. The average price per square metre shall be calculated using the data gathered and published in accordance with Section 151 BC as amended by Section 37 of the Residential Tenancies Act. Now, basically, the theory behind this is Section 19 of the Principal Act, the Residential Tenancies Act, sets out that in setting the rent for a property, a landlord can't charge more than the market rent. But that definition really is very loosely defined. It talks about dwellings being of a similar size, type and character to the dwelling and situated in a comparable area in which it's situated. Now, my problem with that is that actually size should be the dominant definer of what dictates a market rent. If you look at daft.ie or any of those websites, you won't see the size in square feet or square metres of any rental property advertised there. Nobody collects data on this, on the price of rental properties in Ireland. Nobody's under any obligation to state the size of a property that they're letting out, and instead we have number of bedrooms acting as a sort of proxy for size. But in Ireland, a two-bedroom apartment can be anything from 40 to 100 square metres. A two-bedroom unit can be a one-bedroom unit with a plywood partition across the bedroom, because there's no real regulation for this at all and no enforcement of standards. One of the girls in my office came across an advertised two-bedroom property in the last number of days in which the second bedroom was so small that the chest of drawers was nailed to the wall above the single bed because, frankly, there was nowhere else for it to go. And there hasn't been an enforcement of standards in that regard. So it's just not good enough. So we're saying this is the market rent to which we're pegging prices. But it's a charade and it's a nonsense. And I do think the definition that I'm putting forward is far better in that regard, because that would enable us to regulate renting in a serious way and set prices and gather the information in that regard. I mean, in Germany, for example, landlords can charge 11% more if they add a certain amount of insulation to a building or other benefits that improve the property. I honestly think that the price per square metre for comparable properties, as being put forward in The first amendment that I have here in this grouping is the only really fair way to come up with a figure for market rent, and it would assist us in collecting the data that is necessary, I believe, in order to drive standards forward. I also think it would tighten things up. I mean, what's a municipal district? You know, the current Act talks about a comparable area. What is that like? Is Sandymount comparable to Clontarf? How do we know what we're actually talking about here? So if you're serious about regulation, if we're going to make it more fair, then we need more data, and I think that my amendment number 2 absolutely does that in a far better way. My amendment number 3, I think, Dáil amendment number 3.
That's yet, Deputy.
No, we are. I think we are. I'm trying to clarify that it's actually
247, 48, 77 and 80.
Yeah, but it's my amendment number 3, I think, to amendment number 47 that we're questioning. I know I tried to ask the Cathaoirleach, like it's head melting the way this is done, but I think that's right, isn't it? It's my number 3 amendment to Shannon's amendment number 47 and 48, and unfortunately I have a big splattering of them, so I'm just kind of working my way through them in this section. Yeah, okay. Yeah, it's very difficult. Anyway, actually, the Dáil amendment number 3, I think, belongs to the Socialist Party, and it's linked, but it is linked to my number 5, which is in this grouping, and number 4, which isn't mine either. And basically, what this bit is about, or these 3 amendments to the Shannon Amendment 47 they're all trying to get rid of the self-destruct clause that the government has placed in this legislation. The clause says that the measure around rents is only going to be allowed to be reviewed and increased every 2 years instead of every year, and that it will cease to have effect in 4 years' time. So this grouping of Dáil amendments deals with that. Now, I know the other deputies from the Socialist Party have done a different interpretation of this, basically to delete this section in its entirety. What I seek to do is something a little bit different than that. I think the idea of a self-destruct clause is ridiculous. Why 4 years? Why exactly 4 years? Why not 3? Why not 2? Why not 1.5? It doesn't make any sense at all. And while deleting subsection 5 is one way of dealing with it, what I'm proposing instead is to put forward a review of these measures in 4 years' time. I'd be happier if that was a review in a year's time, but what I hope to do with this amendment, if it was passed, will be better. We'll go with the 4 instead of the 1. And the review that we're proposing in this particular amendment creates the possibility that the next government will review these measures and decide that they're not good enough, that they don't go far enough. And we specifically provide for that in our amendment, as any review will have to be carried out with a view to the housing situation in the country at the time, the social good and the principle of housing as a human right, none of which seem to have been considered by the Shannon amendment in this part. And as I say, while deleting the subsection entirely is one approach, I believe myself that a review in the hope of enshrining the principle that the rental market and the housing market as a whole should be subjected to serious and regular overview by the Oireachtas is not a bad thing. I think it should be comprehensive, and I think it, should be bound up with the social good, which is what my amendment seeks to do. I mean, I do think it's a bit rich that the government would put in a self-destruct clause and that you would come up with a random 4-year idea. It's completely meaningless and a bit insulting to the Oireachtas as well, to be honest, because, you're an outgoing government. The next administration will decide whether the legislation stays in place or not. Now, personally, I'd be hoping the next government would be ripping it up and starting again from scratch, but there doesn't seem to be any sense in this. So that's that amendment. That's my amendment number 5 to Shannon's amendment number 47. Again, sadly, I'll have the next one, which is amendment number 6 to Shannon's amendment number 47. And this one is dealing with and trying to make it impossible to raise the rent during a tenancy above the rate of inflation, or 5%, whichever is lower. Now, The figures used are based on the practice in Germany, which is widely seen as one of the most tenant-favourable countries in the world. In Germany, there are two types of rental contracts: index rental contracts and stepped rental contracts. And in an index situation, it's linked to inflation, while the stepped rental contracts allow for a certain percentage increase each year, up to a maximum of 20% over 3 years. In some parts of Germany, 15% over 3 years in other parts where there's maybe more rental demand. And this amendment is seeking to combine both of those tactics. It would mean that rents couldn't increase above inflation, and if it ever came to pass that inflation was skyrocketing, then rental increases would be controlled to below 5%. Ireland has had inflation of negative values since 2014, but annual inflation in terms of rents at the beginning of the last quarter stood at 9.3% nationally. In Dublin, in mid-2014, it was 15%. At the moment, 13.5% than a year ago. Higher in Cork City, 12.2%. In Galway, Limerick and Waterford standing at over 11% and 9%. So rent increases and increases in wages are really widely out of sync. I mean, we have a scenario now where a couple earning $42,000 a year who want to rent a 3-bedroom house in Dublin are going to have to spend 47% of their after-tax income on rent at current prices. It's a completely and utterly unsustainable situation, and that's a couple on 42,000 who are probably doing better than a hell of a lot of other people out there either. So we really do need more than rent certainty. We need rents to be controlled. I mean, we've all heard the stories of landlords upping the rent in phenomenal amounts of money in a short space of time, and basically saying, well, if you don't like it, you can always move out. 20% and more increases, which is obviously contributing to the homeless situation, causing huge social disconnection for families, children having to move their schools and so on. And I think when we look at back in 2014, we were told by the PRTB in their report on rent stability in the private rented sector that rent controls would destroy supply, something echoed really by various government spokespeople since. But if you look at that report, there's a very curious line in it which, explains why, in their view, rent control would achieve this, and it's utter nonsense. And they say the difference between the control price and the market price is essentially a subsidy for consumers, and therefore consumers demand more of the product than is necessary. I mean, did you ever hear anything like that for ludicrousness? That rent control will lead to decreased supply if rent controls are introduced, because tenants are going to get greedy and start wanting to rent more properties than they need, which is obviously utterly ludicrous and completely against the notion of housing as a human right. We know also that huge rent increases mid-tenancy have knock-on effects on the alleged market rate. Landlords can point to comparable properties nearby which are commanding higher rents thanks to the huge mid-tenancy increases, and they can start a new tenancy off at an upper limit. So it's not going to do what it says in the tin and assist tenants in that regard. So in this series of amendments here, we haven't pushed for the type of rent control that's been increased in Berlin, where rents at the commencement of tenancies can't be set at higher than the 10% of the local area average. But to be honest, that's the direction that we need to be going in. So this has been put forward, if you like, as a modest gesture that you maybe couldn't even object to, and I don't see any reason, to be honest, why you would. I mean, rent controls is the only way forward. Ultimately, we do need to take our housing complicated mess into account. In that, we have a whole variety of different types of landlords operating in this state, from the big REITs and the professional landlords to the hard-pressed person who happened to have an apartment, couldn't sell it, has it in negative equity, got married and moved out into another place and is really renting it just to pay the mortgage and not even succeeding in doing that. Obviously, there's a lot of buy-to-lets in arrears and so on, but this area of the reluctant landlord landlords need to be addressed as well. I appreciate we can't address one aspect, there is a bigger picture, but we need more than what's been done here, and I think the amendments here are seeking to help that. Now, the last group of amendments that I have in relation to section 47, and they're actually 8 to 11 of my Dáil amendments linked to 47, are all together. They're all trying to achieve the same thing, and what they're seeking to do is insert a retrospective clause into the rent certainty measures that are being discussed. As we know, rents rose at the fastest rate since the boom in the months before the government's introduction of this measure. In fact, I'd say that because of the dithering and the public rowing that took place in the media, you've actually succeeded in moving this legislation and making things worse for tenants in that regard. And what these group of amendments seek to do is a little bit to fix that and to make it so that the increases that took place 60 days or less before this legislation came into effect will be null. And, you know, I do want to put on the record that I think your strategy and the way in which you handled this was so bad that you couldn't be that incompetent and divided, that it's hard to draw any conclusion other than the fact that the dilly-dallying on this was deliberate to allow rogue landlords to drive up their prices, to in a backdoor way appease them, and sadly the hard-pressed tenants are the people who pay the price on that. They're the most important amendments actually that I have. I do have a number of amendments to Shannon's Amendment 48, which is also, unfortunately for me, in this grouping. They're generally of a more technical arrangement. The first one, in relation to 48, is an amendment inserting a provision that a landlord must make a statement to the effect that any rent increase mandated after a rent review is not more than inflation or 5%, whatever is less. Again, this is helping to alleviate a dispute situation. I'll maybe come back to some of the other ones in that grouping, but I'll move these ones for now. Ceann Corlett, thanks for that.
Deputy Coppinger.